My name is Marina, and I am 42 years old. It had been years since I'd heard from my parents in any way that actually mattered, so when my phone lit up with their number that afternoon, my first instinct wasn't relief or excitement. It was suspicion. They had never been the kind to call just to check in. Growing up, their attention had always belonged to my brother, their golden child, the one who could do no wrong no matter how badly he messed up. And then there was me, the one who was always expected to understand, to adjust, to accept less without complaint. I had learned long ago not to expect much from them, especially when it came to my children. From the outside, it probably looked like simple distance, like one of those families who just drift apart over time. But the truth was harsher than that. My parents didn't drift away from my kids, they actively ignored them. Years went by with barely a birthday card, a rushed holiday text if we were lucky, while my brother's children were showered with attention, praise, and money. He stayed close to them, basking in their approval, while I built my life far away from their influence, raising my kids to be independent, grounded, and strong without their help. That independence wasn't something my parents admired. If anything, it seemed to offend them. They had always been so certain they knew best, so convinced that my brother's path was the right one, and mine was some kind of quiet rebellion they tolerated, but never respected. Still, I kept my distance, telling myself it was better this way. My kids didn't need grandparents who only showed up when it was convenient. They were growing into smart, driven people, thriving in ways my parents never expected, and we were doing just fine without outside validation. That's why the sudden call felt wrong, too cheerful, too eager. My mother's voice on the other end of the line was warm in a way I hadn't heard in years, like she was slipping into a role she hadn't bothered to play before. She talked about how long it had been, how time flew, how they'd been thinking a lot lately. And then she said it. They wanted to reconnect. They wanted to get back into my kids' lives to make up for lost time, as if all the years of absence were some minor misunderstanding we could just laugh off. As she spoke, a familiar knot tightened in my stomach. I could already tell where this was going, even if she hadn't said it outright yet. My kids were older now, more accomplished, more confident. They were doing better than anyone could have predicted, certainly better than my brother's children, who had grown up cushioned by money and endless second chances. My parents had noticed, and now, suddenly, they wanted in. I listened quietly, my mind replaying every moment they'd missed, every time my children had looked to me with questions I couldn't fully answer. They wanted to act like nothing had ever been wrong, like they hadn't already made their feelings clear through years of silence and unequal treatment. They wanted to pretend we could just pick up where we left off. And as my mother kept talking, her excitement building, I realized this call wasn't about love or regret. It was about them finally seeing what they'd overlooked and not knowing how to live with that mistake. I asked her what she actually meant by reconnect, forcing my voice to stay steady even as my pulse picked up. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that told me she was choosing her words carefully. She said they'd been thinking it was time to start being more involved, that my kids were older now and it would be nice to catch up, to rebuild what had been lost. She said it so casually, like she was talking about rescheduling a missed dinner instead of years of neglect. The longer she spoke, the more I could feel the old anger creeping back, sharp and familiar. I wanted to interrupt her, to remind her that it wasn't time that had kept them away, it was choice. They chose not to show up. They chose not to care. But I stayed quiet, letting her talk, because something about the way she said all of it made my skin prickle. There was an urgency underneath the warmth, a need to smooth things over quickly before I had a chance to push back. When she finally stopped, waiting for my response, the silence between us felt heavy. I told her I didn't know if my kids were ready for that they hadn't forgotten how they'd been treated. On the other end of the line, her tone shifted almost imperceptibly. She sighed and said that sometimes parents make mistakes and kids need to learn how to move on from the past. The words landed wrong, too dismissive, too rehearsed. It was like she was asking my children to do the emotional work she and my father had avoided for years. I let out a short, bitter laugh before I could stop myself and asked her if she meant her mistakes. She didn't like that. I could hear the irritation creep into her voice as she said they were only trying to help now, that holding on to resentment wasn't healthy. That was when it hit me how deeply disconnected we were. To her, this was about comfort and image. To me, it was about protecting my kids from being treated like they were suddenly valuable only because they'd proven themselves. The conversation ended without resolution, both of us hanging up with things still hanging in the air. I sat there afterward, phone in my hand, replaying every word. The call had reopened wounds I'd spent years stitching closed, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't some spontaneous burst of love. Something had shifted in their world, something that made them realize they'd miscalculated, and now they were trying to correct it, not by owning what they'd done, but by pretending it didn't matter. 2 days passed and the anger didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. I kept thinking about how easily my mother had brushed aside the years of disappointment, how she'd framed it as something my kids needed to get over. I knew I couldn't carry this alone, not again. That evening after dinner, when the house had finally settled into a rare quiet, I sat down next to my husband, Griffin, and told him everything. He listened the way he always did, without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with every detail. When I told him they wanted back into the kids' lives, he raised an eyebrow and asked what I'd said. I admitted I'd shut it down, at least for now, and explained how wrong it felt. When I mentioned the trust fund they'd set up for my brother's kids while leaving ours with nothing, his jaw tightened. He said what they were doing wasn't about family, it was about regret mixed with entitlement. They didn't want a relationship, they wanted absolution. Then he said something that stuck with me. He told me we couldn't keep shielding the kids from the truth. They were old enough to understand what was happening, and how they felt about it mattered. The thought made my chest tighten, but I knew he was right. Whatever happened next, it shouldn't be decided for them. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized the hardest part wasn't confronting my parents, it was preparing to hear what my kids might say when they finally had the full picture. I didn't tell the kids right away. I needed a day to study myself, to decide how much truth to hand them without letting my own anger bleed into it. But the truth had a way of pressing in, and by the next evening, it was impossible to ignore. After homework was done and the dishes were cleared, I asked them to sit with me in the living room. Corbin slouched into the couch first, already suspicious, headphones hanging around his neck. Tamsin followed, quieter, folding herself into the armchair with that watchful look she got when she sensed something serious was coming. I asked them if they remembered how things had always been with their grandparents. Both of them nodded without hesitation. They didn't need prompting. Distance like that leaves a mark. I told them my parents had reached out, that they wanted to reconnect, to spend time together and make up for lost years. Corbin rolled his eyes so hard it almost made me smile despite everything. He muttered something about timing, and Tamsin asked what suddenly made them care now. That question cut deeper than anything my mother had said on the phone. I took a breath and told them the part I'd avoided for years. I told them about the trust fund, about how, when they were younger, I found out their grandparents had quietly set one up for their cousins, while there was nothing for them. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just silence. Corbin sat up straighter. I told them the truth, that it wasn't about money, it was about what the money represented. Choice, value, priority. Corbin was the first to speak, his voice tight. He asked if they really thought he and Tamsin wouldn't amount to anything. I told him yes, that my mother had said as much back then, that she believed their future was already written because of who their parents were. Saying it out loud made my stomach churn all over again. Tamsin didn't say anything at first. She just nodded slowly, like something she'd always felt but never named had finally been confirmed. I told them I wasn't asking them to forgive anyone or to pretend this didn't hurt. I told them that if they didn't want a relationship with their grandparents, I would stand by that decision completely. They deserved the choice I'd never been given. Corbin didn't hesitate. He said he was angry and that he didn't trust people who only showed up when it made them look good. Tamsin agreed, softer but just as firm. She said she didn't hate them, but she didn't feel safe letting them back in, not after everything. The room went quiet after that. Not awkward, just heavy. I felt a strange mix of grief and pride wash over me. Grief for the family we never got to be, and pride in the two people sitting in front of me who knew their worth well enough to protect it. I told them we would handle this together, that no one was going to force them into anything. And in that moment, I knew the balance had shifted. This wasn't just about me pushing back anymore. It was about my children drawing their own line and meaning it. For a few days after that conversation, things were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the air is being held in someone else's lungs. My parents didn't take my silence well. The calls started first, spaced out just enough to feel polite, then closer together when I didn't answer. When that didn't work, the messages changed tone. They stopped asking how the kids were doing and started telling me how hurt they were, how confused, how unfair it felt to be shut out when all they wanted was to be a family again. Then they went straight to the kids. Corbin told me first, casually, like it was almost funny. He came into the kitchen one afternoon and said, "By the way, Grandma called me. I didn't pick up." He said it with a shrug, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Tamsin followed later that night, quieter, saying they'd texted her too. She hadn't replied. Neither of them had. Not because I told them not to, but because they didn't want to. That was the part that hurt the most and relieved me at the same time. A week later, they escalated. They showed up at the school twice. The first time, Tamsin saw them before they saw her. She told me she walked past like they weren't even there, her heart pounding but her face calm. Corbin said he felt angry, not scared. Angry that they thought they could corner him in public after years of pretending he didn't exist. Hearing that made my chest ache. No child should have to feel that kind of resolve toward their own grandparents. That night, my phone rang again. It was my mother. Her voice sounded different this time, softer, shakier in a way that might have worked years ago. She said they were worried. She said they weren't getting any younger, that time was slipping away, that they just wanted a chance before it was too late. She paused in all the right places, letting the implication hang there, before illness, before death, before regret hardened into something permanent. Then she mentioned my father's idea of introducing Corbin to the family business. That's when the guilt finally curdled into something else. Clarity. It wasn't concern, it was leverage. They were offering legacy like a bribe, hoping fear would do what affection never had. I told her calmly that this wasn't her decision to make anymore, that the kids had already chosen, and I was respecting that. She tried to argue, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, as my children being too young to see the bigger picture. I stopped her there. I told her they were old enough to know when someone only shows up when it benefits them. After I hung up, I sat with Griffin at the edge of the bed, exhaustion settling into my bones. I told him everything, the calls, the school, the guilt. He listened, then said something simple and devastatingly true. He said our kids had already lived with enough disappointment. They didn't owe anyone another chance to hurt them. Hearing it out loud felt like permission I didn't know I needed. The next day, I checked in with Corbin and Tamsin again, just to be sure. I wanted them to know this wasn't slipping out of their hands. Corbin told me he was done pretending. Tamsin said she didn't want drama, she just wanted peace. I promised them both they had it. No negotiations, no pressure, no rewriting history to make other people feel better. That's when I knew my parents weren't going to let this go quietly. People who are used to being obeyed rarely do. And I could feel it coming. The final push, the last attempt to regain control through the one person who had always been their mouthpiece, my brother. I wasn't surprised when my brother called. I'd been waiting for it. The way you wait for thunder after seeing lightning crack across the sky. He always played this role for them, the reasonable one, the mediator, the one who could translate their intentions into something that sounded almost fair.
When I saw his name on my screen, I already knew the angle he'd take before I answered. He started off smooth, his voice easy like we were catching up after a long week instead of standing on opposite sides of a family fracture. He said, "Mom and Dad are really upset." He said they didn't understand why things had gone this far. Then he said maybe we could all sit down and talk it through, find some middle ground like adults. I let him talk, listening to the familiar rhythm of his persuasion, the way he always positioned himself just slightly above the mess, as if he hadn't benefited from it. I told him there was nothing to talk through. The kids had made their choice. That should have been the end of it. But he sighed the way he does when he thinks I'm being unreasonable, and said I was letting emotions get in the way of logic. He said I had to be realistic. The money could make a huge difference. The kids could benefit from it just like his had. He said it like he was offering a gift, not revealing exactly what he valued most. That was when something in me finally snapped into place. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that surprised even me. I told him I knew exactly how much his kids had benefited. I had seen the vacations, the cars, the way money flowed through his life like it was guaranteed. I told him he'd built his entire identity around their handouts and called it success. He tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. For once, I didn't soften anything. I told him his kids weren't thriving, they were insulated. They'd never had to work for anything, never had to sit with failure or uncertainty because someone else always swooped in to fix it. I told him that kind of comfort didn't build strength, it built entitlement. There was silence on the line, the first real silence I'd ever heard from him, and I knew the words had landed. He finally spoke again, defensive now, saying he didn't understand that his kids were living the life they deserved. That's when I cut him off. I told him they were living off someone else's hard work, and one day that bubble would burst. When it did, they wouldn't know how to stand on their own, and neither would he. I could hear his breathing change, sharper, angrier, but I didn't stop. I told him my kids didn't need their grandparents' money. They didn't need approval that came with strings attached. They were already doing well because they'd learned how to work, how to fail, how to try again without a safety net waiting underneath them. That was something money couldn't buy, no matter how big the trust fund was. He accused me of being difficult, of holding grudges, of tearing the family apart. I told them the family had been torn apart a long time ago, and all I was doing now was refusing to pretend otherwise. When the call ended, my hands were shaking, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I hadn't won anything, but I'd finally stopped losing myself trying to be understood by people who never listened. After that call with my brother, there was a strange stillness that settled over everything, like the air after a storm finally breaks. No messages, no calls, no sudden emergencies demanding my attention. For the first time since my parents had reached out, I wasn't bracing myself every time my phone buzzed. I hadn't realized how tightly wound I'd been until that tension slowly started to ease. It didn't last. The next day, my parents called again. I let it go to voicemail. Then again and again. When I finally listened, my mother's voice was tight, controlled in that way that meant she was trying very hard not to sound angry. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. She said I was being cruel, that I was punishing them for mistakes they couldn't change. She said they had only ever wanted the best for everyone, that they didn't understand why I was turning the children against them. That was the moment I knew I had to stop letting these conversations trail off into silence. Avoiding them wasn't protecting my kids anymore. It was just delaying the inevitable. So I called them back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I told them exactly what Corbin and Tamsin had said, without softening a single word. I told them my children didn't trust them, that they felt like an afterthought, that they weren't interested in pretending the past hadn't happened just to make adults feel better. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, and then my mother started explaining, justifying, reframing everything as a misunderstanding. I stopped her. I told her it wasn't her job to make my kids understand anymore. That chance had passed. I told her this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about consequences. They had chosen where to put their time, their money, and their belief for years, and now they were living with the result of those choices. I said my kids didn't owe them access, affection, or grace just because they shared DNA. The silence that followed was long and heavy. When my father finally spoke, his voice was colder than I expected. He said I was making a mistake, that family loyalty mattered more than pride, that one day I'd regret this. I told him calmly that I regretted staying quiet for as long as I had. Then I ended the call. That night, I sat with Griffin at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. There was a shared understanding between us now, a sense that something permanent had shifted. The kids were upstairs laughing about something I couldn't hear clearly, and that sound grounded me more than any reassurance ever could. I checked in with Corbin and Tamsin one more time, not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted them to know I was still listening. Corbin told me he felt relieved. Tamsin said she finally felt like no one was trying to rewrite her feelings anymore. Hearing that made every uncomfortable conversation worth it. I knew my parents would tell their version of this story. I knew my brother would too. In their version, I would be difficult, ungrateful, stubborn. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself against that narrative. My children knew the truth. I knew the truth. And that was enough. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. There were moments of sadness, flashes of guilt that crept in when I least expected them. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if things could have been different, if I'd pushed harder years ago, if I'd demanded more sooner. But those thoughts didn't linger the way they used to. I'd learned that you can't negotiate your way into being valued by people who decided long ago where you stood. My parents stopped calling after a while. Not all at once, but gradually, like someone testing a locked door before finally accepting it wouldn't open. My brother kept his distance too. I imagine it was easier for him to paint me as the villain than to examine his own comfort in a system that worked in his favor. I made peace with that. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just acceptance. What surprised me most was how light everything felt once the noise faded. Our home felt calmer. Conversations with my kids were easier, more open. There was no longer an unspoken tension about grandparents' expectations or comparisons. Corbin focused on his plans with a confidence that came from knowing he'd earned everything he had. Tamsin seemed steadier, more sure of herself, no longer questioning whether she was missing out on something she'd never really been offered in the first place. One evening, as we sat around the table talking about nothing important at all, I realized something quietly profound. My parents had always believed love was something you rationed, something you invested where it would give you the best return. But what Griffin and I had built here was different. It wasn't flashy, it didn't come with trust funds or promises of legacy. It came with consistency, respect, and the freedom to be exactly who we were without earning permission. I don't know if my parents ever truly understood what they lost. I don't know if my brother ever questioned the ease of the life he was handed. Maybe one day they will. Maybe they won't. Either way, it's no longer my responsibility to make them see it. What I do know is this. My children didn't need to be chosen by people who only noticed them when it was convenient. They were already chosen every day in a home that valued them for who they were, not what they could prove. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing approval from anyone who withheld it as a form of power. We moved forward quietly, without announcements or dramatic finales. Just a family that had learned where its boundaries were and finally had the courage to keep them.